The morning of February 19th, 1945, Iwo Jima, Corporal Robert Mueller crouched in the well of his Higgins boat, watching volcanic ash rain down on the steel deck. Around him, 70,000 Marines prepared to storm an 8-square-mile island that American planners believed would fall in 5 days. They had been told the Japanese defenders were demoralized, their positions destroyed by months of bombardment. They had been told this would be quick. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The Japanese had other plans. For 36 days, the Battle of Iwo Jima would shatter every assumption American military planners held about Japanese defensive tactics. The banzai charges, the suicidal rushes that had defined Pacific warfare, would be conspicuously absent. In their place, Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi had engineered something far more deadly, a defense so sophisticated, so calculated, that it would inflict more American casualties than Japanese deaths, the only battle in the entire Pacific War where this ratio would reverse. Nearly 7,000 Marines would die, another 20,000 would be wounded. The Japanese called Marines suicidal for their frontal assaults. By the time Mount Suribachi fell, the Marines would understand that the true suicide had been believing this island would surrender easily. Japanese military doctrine in the Pacific had, until 1944, followed a consistent pattern. Beach defenses, immediate counterattacks, banzai charges when defeat loomed inevitable. These tactics, rooted in Bushido philosophy and the concept of Gyokusai shatter duel, the honorable death had defined Japanese resistance from Guadalcanal to Saipan. At Guadalcanal in August 1942, Colonel Kiyonao Ichiki led 800 soldiers in a direct assault on American lines at the Tenaru River. The attack failed catastrophically. Most of Ichiki's force was annihilated by concentrated machine gun fire. Ichiki committed suicide. At Atu in May 1943, Colonel Yasuyo Yamasaki launched 2,600 troops against American artillery positions in Massacre Bay. Only 28 Japanese soldiers survived. 549 Americans died, but the Japanese force ceased to exist as a fighting unit. These banzai charges, human wave attacks crying, "Tenoheika Banzai, long live the Emperor," had become expected. American Marines trained specifically to repel them. Automatic weapons, interlocking fields of fire, artillery support. The tactics were devastating against massed infantry charges. By mid-1944, Japanese commanders recognized that traditional defensive doctrine was producing predictable, catastrophic defeats. Banzai charges had originated during the Russo-Japanese War at the Siege of Port Arthur in 1904. Japanese infantry assaulted Russian machine gun positions in wave attacks that left, according to one description, a thick, unbroken mass of corpses, covered the cold earth like a coverlet. Despite horrific casualties, the tactic became embedded in Japanese military culture as an expression of supreme loyalty and courage. In China, during the 1930s, banzai charges proved occasionally effective against nationalist forces armed primarily with bolt-action rifles. Numerically smaller Japanese units using superior training and bayonets could overwhelm larger Chinese formations that lacked automatic weapons. This reinforced Japanese military leadership's belief in the spiritual superiority of their soldiers, that fighting spirit could overcome material disadvantage. But in the Pacific, against American forces equipped with Browning automatic rifles, Mieden Garands, and belt-fed machine guns, banzai charges became suicide in the most literal sense. At Saipan, in July 1944, Lieutenant General Yoshitsugu Saito ordered the largest banzai charge of the entire war. 4,000 Japanese troops, the able-bodied leading, the wounded following with improvised weapons, civilians carrying bamboo spears, launched a 15-hour assault against American lines. Nearly all Japanese participants died. They killed or wounded 650 Americans but achieved no tactical objective. Saito committed seppuku in a cave with his sword. The American public had formed a specific image of the Japanese soldier by 1945, fanatical, willing to die pointlessly, incapable of sophisticated military thinking, charging blindly into machine gun fire. This perception, though based on observed behavior, created dangerous assumptions. It led American planners to believe that Japanese defenses, while tenacious, were predictable. It led them to underestimate Japanese capacity for tactical innovation. Iwo Jima would destroy these assumptions systematically. The island itself seemed insignificant, 8 square miles, shaped like a pork chop. Dominated by Mount Suribachi, a 550-foot volcanic cone at the southern tip. The rest of the island, a plateau riddled with ravines, rocky terrain, and scrub vegetation. No strategic value except location. 750 miles from Tokyo, directly on the flight path between the newly captured Mariana Islands and the Japanese home islands. American B-20 Nineteenth, the superfortress bombers conducting the strategic bombing campaign against Japan, flew past Iwo Jima on every mission. Japanese radar on the island provided early warning of incoming raids, allowing Tokyo 2 hours to prepare fighters and air defenses. Japanese fighters, based on Iwo Jima's 2 completed airfields, harassed returning bombers. From August through October 1944, American bomber groups flew nearly 50 missions attempting to neutralize Iwo Jima's air capabilities. Damage was consistently repaired. The island's defenses, observers noted, seemed impervious to aerial bombardment. For American strategic planners, Iwo Jima represented an essential stepping stone. Capture the island, eliminate the early warning capability, remove the fighter threat, and provide emergency landing facilities for damaged bombers. The Joint Chiefs of Staff issued their directive on October 3, 1944, take Iwo Jima. The operation received a designation, Operation Detachment. Target date, February 19, 1945. Force composition, V Amphibious Corps, under Major General Harry Schmidt. 3 Marine Divisions, the 3rd, 4th and 5th. Approximately 70,000 assault troops, supporting them 450 ships, complete air supremacy, unlimited ammunition, overwhelming firepower. Intelligence estimates calculated the Japanese garrison at 13,000 troops. The actual number was 21,000. Planning for Operation Detachment followed the standard amphibious assault model that had succeeded throughout the Central Pacific Campaign. Preliminary bombardment, shore landings, rapid advance inland to seize objectives. Consolidation. Based on previous operations and intelligence assessments, planners estimated Iwo Jima would be secured in 5 days, perhaps a week if Japanese resistance proved unexpectedly stubborn. Major General Harry Schmidt, commanding the Marine Landing Force, requested a 10-day preliminary bombardment. He had studied intelligence reports showing extensive fortifications. He wanted time to methodically destroy Japanese positions before his Marines went ashore. Rear Admiral William H.P. Blandy, commander of the Amphibious Support Force, refused. A 10-day bombardment would exhaust ammunition supplies before the landings. Schmidt asked for 9 days. Blandy again refused and authorized only 3 days of naval bombardment, 14,000 tons of shells. Navy planners believed this would be sufficient. After all, how much fortification could exist on 8 square miles of volcanic rock? The answer was being constructed beneath their targeting solutions. In May 1944, Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi arrived on Iwo Jima with explicit orders from Prime Minister Hideki Toyo. Hold this island to the last man. Toyo told Kuribayashi directly, "Only you among all the generals are qualified and capable of holding this post. The entire army and the nation will depend upon you for the defense of that key island." The assignment was tantamount to a death sentence. Kuribayashi understood this. His letters to his wife before the invasion made his acceptance explicit. "No one here expects to return alive. but we are determined to do our best. Do not plan for my return. Do not be surprised when you hear that I have died." Kuribayashi was an unusual choice for commanding a doomed defense. He had spent years in the United States, including cavalry training at Fort Bliss, Texas, in the 1920s. He understood American industrial capacity. He respected American military effectiveness. Unlike many Japanese officers, Kuribayashi held no illusions about ultimate Japanese victory. His task was not to win, but to extract the highest possible price for American success. He began by studying every previous island defense in the Pacific War: Tarawa, Saipan, Peleliu. He analyzed what worked, what failed, why. The pattern was clear. Beach defenses were destroyed by naval bombardment. Banzai charges were slaughtered by automatic weapons. Traditional Japanese defensive doctrine was producing devastating defeats in days. Kuribayashi concluded that conventional tactics would fail within 72 hours on Iwo Jima. He decided to abandon conventional tactics entirely. Before Kuribayashi's arrival, Lieutenant General Hideyoshi Obata had begun constructing beach defenses following standard doctrine: pillboxes near the shore, artillery positions overlooking landing zones, concentrations of troops prepared to counterattack immediately. Kuribayashi countermanded these orders. No significant beach defenses. No immediate counterattacks. No banzai charges. Instead, defense in depth. Let the Americans land unopposed. Let them advance inland. Then kill them systematically from positions they cannot see, cannot suppress, cannot destroy. The island's volcanic geology made this possible. The entire northern two-thirds of Iwo Jima was honeycombed with natural caves and crevices. Kuribayashi expanded these into an underground fortress of unprecedented complexity. 11 miles of tunnels, multiple levels connected by shafts, reinforced concrete chambers, ventilation systems, underground hospitals, ammunition depots, communications centers, barracks. Some chambers were large enough to hold 500 men. The main command post south of Kita village measured 50 meters long, 20 meters wide. Walls and ceilings were reinforced with concrete thick enough to withstand direct hits from 16-inch naval shells. Mining engineers arrived from Japan with blueprints for the tunnel system. Every major hill was hollowed out and fortified. Hill 382, the second highest point on the island, contained a radio station, weather center, and Colonel Chosaku Kaido's artillery headquarters. The hill's defensive positions featured multiple firing apertures, allowing artillery pieces to be repositioned quickly along interior tunnels. American bombardment might destroy one firing position, but the gun would reappear elsewhere minutes later, firing from a different angle. Pillboxes and bunkers were constructed with interlocking fields of fire designed specifically to create kill zones. Every approach, every ravine, every potential avenue of advance was covered by multiple weapons: machine guns, artillery, mortars, positioned not on ridgelines where they would be visible but in defilade positions, in caves, behind rocky outcroppings. Many positions were mutually supporting. Attacking one pillbox meant exposing your flanks to fire from two others. The defensive system's sophistication exceeded anything American forces had encountered. Every position had multiple entrances and exits. If Americans assaulted one entrance, defenders could withdraw through tunnels and reappear elsewhere. If Americans called in artillery or naval gunfire on a position, defenders retreated into reinforced chambers deep underground, then returned to their firing positions when the bombardment lifted. Kuribayashi issued explicit orders forbidding banzai charges. His tactical directive stated, "Each man will make it his duty to kill 10 of the enemy before dying. Until we are destroyed to the last man, we shall harass the enemy by guerrilla tactics." This represented a fundamental departure from Japanese military culture. No glorious charge, no honorable death in mass suicide. Instead, grinding attrition warfare. Kill as many Americans as possible. Make them pay for every yard. Delay the invasion of Japan itself by forcing the Americans to spend weeks digging defenders out of positions that traditional tactics would have abandoned in days. Not all Japanese officers agreed with Kuribayashi's approach. His chief of staff, Major Hori, advocated for traditional counterattacks. Some officers believed that abandoning banzai charges represented dishonorable warfare, un-Japanese, cowardly. Kuribayashi overrode these objections with direct orders. This battle would be fought his way. No exceptions. Reinforcements arrived gradually through 1944, despite American air and submarine interdiction. The 2nd Independent Mixed Brigade under Major General Kotao Osuga transferred from Chichi Island. 2,700 men from the 145th Infantry Regiment arrived after Saipan fell. Naval Infantry. Artillery units, anti-aircraft batteries, tank units. By January 1945, Kuribayashi commanded approximately 21,000 troops, though American intelligence still estimated only 13,000. The Japanese garrison prepared for months. They dug. They reinforced. They registered fields of fire. They stockpiled ammunition in multiple underground depots so that no single strike could eliminate their supplies. They created detailed fire plans coordinating infantry, artillery, and mortars to concentrate on specific zones. They prepared for a battle they knew they would lose, but intended to make unforgettable. Starting June 15, 1944, American forces began the longest and most intensive preliminary bombardment of the Pacific War. Naval artillery, B-24 bombers, B-29 superfortresses. For 9 months, Iwo Jima was hammered constantly. 74 consecutive days of bombing raids, thousands of tons of high explosives. American planners assumed that most Japanese defenders were being killed. Intelligence reports indicated weakening defenses. Reconnaissance photographs showed cratered terrain, destroyed surface installations. What they could not see was that Kuribayashi's real fortress existed underground, largely untouched. February 19, 1945. H-hour 9 Compte. 0. 70,000 Marines aboard 450 ships prepared for the assault. The bombardment plan called for a final intensive strike before the landings. Battleships, cruisers, destroyers. They pounded Iwo Jima's beaches with coordinated fire. Then the landing craft formed up. First wave, amphibious tractors carrying assault infantry. Second wave, tanks and support vehicles. Behind them, thousands more Marines waiting their turn to go ashore. At Oshem, 59, naval guns lifted fire from the beaches. At 9.0, the first wave hit the volcanic sand. Marines poured from landing craft, expecting the hell that had greeted them at Tarawa, Peleliu, Saipan. Machine gun fire from the beach. Mortars, artillery, concentrated defensive fire, designed to stop the invasion at the waterline. Instead, silence. Marines ran across open beach. They climbed the steep terraces of volcanic ash. They established positions. They waited for counterattacks that didn't come. Some Marines actually believed the bombardment had worked, that Japanese defenders had been killed or demoralized, that perhaps this landing would be easier than expected. Then they advanced 500 yards inland. Kuribayashi's plan unfolded with devastating precision. Once American forces were concentrated on the narrow beaches, packed into a confined space with more troops landing continuously, he ordered his artillery to open fire. Hidden guns in Mount Suribachi, artillery on the northern heights, mortars from positions the Marines couldn't see. Concentrated fire from multiple directions transformed the landing beaches into a killing ground. Marines couldn't identify where fire was coming from. Smoke obscured the battlefield. Volcanic ash absorbed explosions. Soldiers running through the ash sank to their calves, making rapid movement impossible. The terrain itself seemed designed to impede the attackers. Tanks bogged down. Vehicles struggled in the soft ground. All the while, Japanese artillery methodically targeted concentrations of troops, supply dumps, command posts. By day's end, 30,000 Marines had landed on Iwo Jima, casualties on D-Day, 2,400, higher than on D-Day at Normandy's Omaha Beach, and unlike previous Pacific landings where the first day's casualties were the worst, at Iwo Jima, the bloodletting was just beginning. The Marines who went ashore that morning believed they were facing a standard Japanese defense, tough but predictable. They expected banzai charges within 24 hours. They expected frantic counterattacks, attempting to push them back into the sea. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. They expected the pattern that had defined every previous Pacific battle. What they got instead was an enemy who had studied them, understood their doctrine, and engineered a defense specifically calculated to negate American advantages in firepower, air support, and material superiority. An enemy who would refuse to charge into machine gun fire and instead force the Americans to come to them, into prepared killing zones, into terrain that neutralized American tactical mobility. The Marines had landed on an island where every natural feature had been converted into a defensive position, where the enemy was invisible until the moment they fired, where naval bombardment and air strikes could pound the surface all day without touching the defenders sheltered in reinforced bunkers 30 feet underground. Lieutenant General Holland M. Smith, commanding Fleet Marine Force Pacific, would later describe Iwo Jima as the most savage and costly battle in the history of the Marine Corps. The island's capture would require not mobility, not maneuver, not tactical brilliance, just relentless frontal assault, maintained with grinding, bloody persistence. It was an operation of one phase and one tactic, Smith wrote. Frontal assault until the mission was completed. The Japanese had called American tactics suicidal. They were about to prove that characterization accurate, but they would also demonstrate that calculated defense, properly executed, could make even American material superiority irrelevant. For 36 days, Iwo Jima would consume Marines at a rate unprecedented in American military history. This was not the Pacific War the Marines had trained for. This was something new, something more terrible, and it had only just begun. February 20th, 1945. Dawn revealed the scope of what the Marines faced. Mount Suribachi dominated the southern end of the island, its slopes honeycombed with caves and firing positions. To the north stretched the plateau, a nightmare landscape of ravines, rocky outcroppings, and broken terrain that the Marines would come to know by names that reflected their horror: the Meat Grinder, Turkey Nobe, the Amphitheatre, Bloody Gorge. The 4th Marine Division pushed toward the Quarry, a Japanese strongpoint on the eastern coast. The 5th Division's 28th Marines moved to isolate Mount Suribachi. Both tasks were accomplished, but at tremendous cost. Every yard gained required coordinated assaults against positions that couldn't be flanked, couldn't be bypassed, could only be destroyed through direct assault. The tactical reality was brutally simple. Japanese defenders occupied fortified positions with clear fields of fire. They were invisible until they fired. Once their position was identified, Marines would call in airstrikes, naval gunfire, artillery. Shells would pound the position, smoke would clear, Marines would advance, and fire would erupt from the same position, the defenders having retreated into tunnels during the bombardment, then returned to their weapons when it lifted. Breaking these positions required flamethrowers, demolition charges, grenades, and close combat. Marines would assault a pillbox. One team would lay down suppressing fire, while another maneuvered close enough to use a flamethrower through the firing aperture or toss demolition charges inside. Even then, defenders might escape through tunnels and reappear elsewhere. Or they would fight to the death inside, forcing Marines to clear each position room by room in hand-to-hand combat. Private First Class Jacqueline Lucas exemplified the desperate nature of this fighting. Having lied about his age to enlist and gone AWOL to fight at Iwo Jima, Lucas found himself in the middle of a Japanese counterattack on February 20th. 2 grenades landed among his platoon. Without hesitation, Lucas threw himself on both grenades, using his body to shield his comrades. Miraculously, he survived massive injuries and received the Medal of Honor. He was 17 years old. Gunnery Sergeant John Basilone, who had received the Medal of Honor at Guadalcanal, landed on Iwo Jima with the invasion force. He led his machine gun section ashore, personally destroying a Japanese blockhouse that blocked their advance. Under heavy fire, he guided a tank safely through a minefield. Moments later, a Japanese mortar round killed him. For his actions that day, Basilone posthumously received the Navy Cross. The Marine Corps' most decorated enlisted man died on the first day of battle. By February 23rd, the 28th Marines had fought their way up Mount Suribachi's slopes. Every cave had to be cleared. Every position had to be destroyed. At 10:20 that morning, a 40-man patrol reached the summit. First Lieutenant Harold Schreier led the patrol, carrying a small American flag. They secured the crater and raised the flag. Across the island and on ships offshore, Marines and sailors cheered. It was the first piece of Japanese home territory to fall to American forces. Later that day, a second, larger flag was raised. Associated Press photographer Joe Rosenthal captured the moment. His photograph, 6 Marines struggling to raise the flag against a stiff wind, would become the most iconic image of the Pacific War, eventually reproduced as the Marine Corps War Memorial in Arlington, Virginia. But Mount Suribachi's capture, dramatic as it was, represented only the southern tip of the island. To the north, Kuribayashi's main defences remained intact. The real battle was about to begin. The terrain north of the airfields defied conventional assault tactics. Hill 382 and its surrounding features Turkey Nobe, the amphitheatre formed what Marines came to call the meat grinder. This complex of fortified positions controlled the approaches to the northern plateau. Taking it would require frontal assault against mutually supporting positions that had been registered for defensive fire months earlier. The 4th Marine Division's 25th Marines attacked Turkey Knob repeatedly. They would advance, take casualties, be forced back by counterfire from supporting positions. Artillery would pound the hill. The Marines would attack again. Same result. The Japanese defenders had constructed positions that could only be reduced by direct assault, and every assault was channeled into predetermined killing zones. Historians would later describe the fighting as throwing human flesh against reinforced concrete. The comparison was accurate. American advantages in firepower became irrelevant when the enemy was 30 feet underground in reinforced bunkers. Air superiority meant nothing when defenders were invisible. Naval gunfire could pound the surface all day without reaching the positions that mattered. What remained was infantry combat at its most primitive and brutal. Marines with rifles, grenades, flamethrowers, and demolition charges against an enemy who fought from fortified positions, who could retreat through tunnels when overwhelmed, who had predetermined every field of fire and registered every approach. The mathematics were simple and terrible. American casualties mounted in direct proportion to ground gained. By March 4th, 2 weeks into the battle, combat efficiency in all 3 Marine divisions had degraded to dangerously low levels. Infantry battalions that landed with 900 men now numbered 300 effectives. Some companies that began with 200 Marines now fielded 40. Casualties among officers and NCOs were disproportionately high. They led from the front and were targeted specifically. Units were being commanded by junior officers and sergeants who would have been squad leaders 2 weeks earlier. The 3rd Marine Division, held in reserve during the initial landings, committed to the line on February 21st. Even with fresh troops, progress measured in yards. The terrain favoured defence absolutely. Every ravine was a natural trench system, every rocky outcropping, concealed firing positions. Every ridge provided defilade for defenders and exposure for attackers. Woody Williams, a corporal with the 21st Marines, demonstrated the kind of individual heroism required to advance at all. On February 23rd, armed with a flamethrower, Williams systematically eliminated Japanese pillboxes holding up his unit's advance. For 4 hours, he operated in front of American lines, approaching fortified positions alone, destroying them with his flamethrower while under constant fire. His actions earned the Medal of Honor and illustrated the only tactic that worked: get close enough to kill them directly. Previous battles had followed a pattern: initial defense, then desperate counterattacks, when Japanese commanders recognized defeat was inevitable. These counterattacks, while suicidal, at least forced the Japanese into the open, where American firepower could destroy them. At Iwo Jima, Kuribayashi's prohibition on banzai charges meant that defenders stayed in their fortifications, forcing the Americans to come to them. Some Japanese officers defied Kuribayashi's orders. On February 21st, approximately 700 Japanese naval infantry launched a counterattack in the 4th Division's sector. It was described as a mini banzai attack, smaller than the massive charges at Saipan or Attu, but executed with the same desperate ferocity. Nearly all 700 attackers were killed. The attack achieved nothing tactically but demonstrated what Kuribayashi understood: that traditional banzai charges wasted men without inflicting proportionate casualties. As March progressed, the battle became a grim war of attrition. Advance. Clear positions. Consolidate. Advance again. Naval gunfire provided continuous support. Marine and Navy aircraft flew close air support missions. Artillery pounded identified positions. Yet, progress remained, measured in dozens of yards per day, not hundreds. Airfield No. 2 was secured on March 4th after hard fighting. That same day, a B-29 named Dynamite, crippled during a raid on Tokyo, made an emergency landing on Airfield No. 1. It was the first of approximately 2,200 emergency landings that would occur on Iwo Jima. During the remainder of the war, the primary justification offered for the battle's terrible cost. The strategic debate about Iwo Jima's value began even while the battle raged. Critics questioned whether the casualties were justified. As early as April 1945, retired Chief of Naval Operations William Fife Pratt wrote in Newsweek that the expenditure of manpower to acquire a small God-forsaken island seemed excessive. The Marines, who bore the casualties, had not been consulted in the planning. The decision to invade had been made by Navy and Army Air Force planners, who needed the island for different reasons and who would not be the ones paying in blood. By mid-March, organized resistance in the 4th and 5th Division sectors was crumbling, but the 3rd Division faced continued fierce fighting in the north. The final defensive positions, concentrated near Kitano Point, required 2 more weeks of brutal combat to reduce. March 25th. After more than 5 weeks of continuous fighting, approximately 300 Japanese soldiers, all that remained, of Kuribayashi's 21,000-man garrison, launched a final attack against American positions near the airfields. Unlike previous banzai charges screaming, "Tenno Haika Banzai," this attack came silently in the pre-dawn darkness. It was not a glorious charge, but a desperate raid by starving, wounded men who had run out of food, water, and ammunition. The attack overran several American positions before being contained. 100 Marines and Army Air Force personnel were killed. The Japanese attackers were annihilated. Among the dead, presumably, was Lieutenant General Kuribayashi himself, though his body was never conclusively identified. True to his word, he had fought to the end. March 26, 1945. 36 days after the first Marines landed, Iwo Jima was declared secure. The cost: 6,821 American dead, 19,217 wounded. Total American casualties, 26,038. The Japanese garrison, approximately 22,000 killed. Only 216 prisoners taken, less than 1% of the defending force. An estimated 3,000 went into hiding during the initial American occupation. By August 1945, most had been killed, captured, or surrendered. One group didn't lay down arms until 1949. In the assault units, the infantry battalions doing the actual fighting casualty rates reached 75%. Some companies suffered 90% casualties. The 3rd, 4th, and 5th Marine Divisions were essentially destroyed as effective fighting forces and required months of reconstitution. 27 Medals of Honor were awarded for actions on Iwo Jima, more than any other single battle in American military history. This represented over 1/4 of all Medals of Honor awarded to Marines in the entire war. The concentration of such awards reflected not exceptional heroism by historical standards, but the exceptional circumstances that required such heroism simply to advance at all. The battle's lessons profoundly influenced American planning for Operation Downfall, the proposed invasion of Japan's home islands, scheduled for November 1945. If a small island with 21,000 defenders cost 26,000 casualties to capture, what would invading Kyushu and Honshu cost? Staff estimates projected hundreds of thousands, possibly millions of American casualties. Japanese casualties, military and civilian, would be incalculable. These projections influenced President Truman's decision to authorize the use of atomic weapons against Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The strategic value of Iwo Jima remains debated. The 2,200 B-29 landings saved lives, though post-war analysis revealed that over 80% were for routine refueling or training, not combat damage. The fighter escorts based on Iwo Jima provided some protection for bombing raids, but didn't fundamentally change the strategic bombing campaign's effectiveness. The early warning radar, once eliminated, couldn't compensate for the lives spent eliminating it. What is undebatable is what the battle demonstrated about Japanese defensive capabilities and American tactical limitations. Kuribayashi proved that traditional banzai charges were not inevitable, that Japanese forces could execute sophisticated defensive operations, that material superiority could be negated by proper use of terrain and fortification. He transformed a battle American planners expected to win in 5 days into a 36-day nightmare that inflicted casualties exceeding those suffered by defenders the only time in the Pacific War this occurred. The Marines who fought on Iwo Jima returned with a profound respect for their enemy that transcended the propaganda narratives of Japanese fanaticism. They had not faced suicidal charges. They had faced calculated, disciplined defense executed by soldiers who understood modern warfare's realities and adapted their tactics accordingly. The mythology of Japanese military incompetence, of blind obedience leading to wasteful banzai charges, of spiritual fervor substituting for tactical sophistication, all of this died in Iwo Jima's volcanic ash. What replaced it was recognition that the enemy they faced was capable of remarkable military innovation when properly led. Kuribayashi's tactical approach, defense in depth, prohibition of banzai charges, attrition warfare designed to maximize enemy casualties, represented the opposite of what Americans expected from Japanese commanders. It demonstrated that the stereotype of the suicidal Japanese soldier was not innate Japanese military culture, but rather the result of specific tactical doctrines that some Japanese commanders recognized as obsolete. At Peleliu in September 1944, Lieutenant General Sadai Inoue had pioneered similar tactics. No beach defense, no banzai charges, fighting from caves and fortified positions. The battle for Peleliu, predicted to take 4 days, required more than 2 months. Kuribayashi studied Inoue's success and expanded on it, engineering the most sophisticated defensive system in the Pacific War. The irony was complete. Americans had characterized Japanese tactics as suicidal. They had trained to repel banzai, charges. They had developed doctrine specifically to exploit Japanese tendencies toward frontal assault, and when the Japanese abandoned these tactics, when they adopted defensive strategies that maximized American casualties, the Americans had no effective counter except frontal assault themselves, the very tactic they had criticized as suicidal when the Japanese employed it. The names Marines gave to Iwo Jima's battlefields reflected their experience: the meat grinder, bloody gorge, the amphitheater. These weren't dramatic exaggerations. They were accurate descriptions of terrain where Marines were fed into killing zones against positions that could only be taken by direct assault, regardless of casualties. The meat grinder consumed 850 Marines, capturing a single Japanese strongpoint. Bloody Gorge, where Japanese defenders made their final stand, required days of close combat to clear completely. Combat fatigue, what would later be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder, affected nearly every Marine who served the full 36 days. The constant casualties, the deaths of friends, the relentless exposure to combat without relief, the knowledge that every yard forward meant more Marines would die, these produced psychological casualties at unprecedented rates. Medical personnel reported Marines who had functioned effectively for weeks suddenly breaking down, unable to continue. Some of the bravest men simply reached their limit and could not go on. The physical environment compounded the psychological stress. Volcanic ash that made movement exhausting, sulfurous fumes from volcanic vents, the smell of death that permeated the island as temperatures rose and bodies couldn't be recovered from contested areas. The constant noise of artillery, mortars, small arms fire, days without sleep, water shortages. The wounded screaming for corpsmen. The dead piled in improvised cemeteries because there was no time for proper burial. Navy. Corpsmen, the medics assigned to Marine units, suffered disproportionate casualties. When Marines were hit, they called corpsmen. The corpsmen would run to them through fire to provide aid. Japanese snipers learned to target corpsmen specifically, knowing that wounded Marines would call for them and that corpsmen would respond regardless of danger. 209 Navy corpsmen died on Iwo Jima, providing medical care to Marines. Their courage became legendary within the Corps. The flag raising on Mount Suribachi, immortalized in Rosenthal's photograph, provided a moment of hope during the battle's darkest period. But even that moment was costly. Of the 6 Marines who raised the second flag, 3 died before the island was secured. Sergeant Michael Strank, Corporal Harlan Block, and Private First Class Franklin Sousley were all killed in subsequent fighting. The 3 survivors, Navy Corpsman John Bradley, Private First Class René Gagnon, and Private First Class Ira. Hayes returned to America as heroes, but struggled with survivor's guilt and the gap between public perception and combat reality. The battle's end brought no celebration, only exhaustion and relief. The Marines who survived were evacuated for rest and refit. The divisions required complete reconstitution. New recruits, new officers, new NCOs replaced the casualties. The veterans who remained carried Iwo Jima with them permanently in wounds, in memories, in the knowledge of what industrial age warfare at its worst actually meant. For the Japanese soldiers who fought under Kuribayashi's command, the battle represented something different. They had been ordered to delay the American advance, to inflict maximum casualties, to fight without expectation of reinforcement, resupply, or survival. They had accomplished this mission completely. Every man understood he would die. Kuribayashi's tactical genius gave their deaths military meaning rather than the empty symbolism of banzai and charges. The prisoners taken 216 out of 21,000 represented less than 1% of the garrison. This was not because Japanese soldiers couldn't surrender. It was because Kuribayashi's defensive system required manning positions until killed. There was no retreat, no withdrawal, no safe surrender. Defenders fought until their position was overrun or until they died. Many committed suicide rather than surrender, not from fanaticism but from the practical knowledge that wounded, starving soldiers couldn't escape American forces. The battle's statistical uniqueness bears repeating. Iwo Jima was the only major Pacific battle where American casualties exceeded Japanese deaths. This ratio, more attackers killed and wounded than defenders, validated Kuribayashi's entire defensive concept. Given unlimited time and resources, he could not have designed a more effective defense. The 36-day duration, nearly 5 times longer than American, planners predicted achieved Kuribayashi's objective of delaying the American advance toward Japan. Whether this delay justified the Japanese casualties is a different question. By February 1945, Japan had lost the war. The Imperial Navy was destroyed. The industrial base was being systematically demolished by B-29 raids. American submarines had severed supply lines. Defeat was inevitable. Kuribayashi knew this. His mission was not to prevent defeat, but to make defeat so costly that Japan might negotiate terms rather than face unconditional surrender. This strategy failed ultimately. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki forced Japan's unconditional surrender. But the casualty projections from Iwo Jima and Okinawa influenced Truman's decision to use atomic weapons. If invading small islands cost this much, invading the home islands would cost more than the American public would accept. This calculation that conventional invasion would produce unacceptable casualties made atomic weapons appear to be the less costly option. The legacy of Iwo Jima within the Marine Corps transcends statistics. The battle became definitional, the ultimate test of Marine Corps doctrine, tactics, and spirit. It validated the Corps' existence as a separate service. If Marines could take Iwo Jima against those odds, they could take anything. This narrative, while factually accurate, also served institutional purposes. The battle's cost justified future Marine Corps budgets, modernization programs, and expansion. Kuribayashi's defense demonstrated conclusively that the stereotype of Japanese military incompetence was false. When properly led, Japanese forces could execute sophisticated operations. When given realistic objectives, they could achieve remarkable results. The banzai charge was not inevitably Japanese, but rather a specific tactic that some Japanese commanders had the wisdom to abandon. For Americans who characterized Japanese tactics as suicidal, Iwo Jima offered painful irony. The Marines who assaulted fortified positions day after day, who advanced into predetermined killing zones, who executed frontal assaults against mutually supporting positions. These were the tactics they had called suicidal. When the Japanese employed them at Tarawa, Saipan, and Peleliu, the difference was that Marines had no choice. The island had to be taken. The positions had to be reduced. There was no tactical alternative except the one Kuribayashi forced upon them: frontal assault, regardless of cost. The Japanese called Marines suicidal. For 36 days on Iwo Jima, this characterization proved accurate, not because Marines were fanatical or because they sought death, but because the tactical situation required accepting casualties to accomplish the mission. This was not Bushido. This was modern industrial warfare at its most brutal, where courage and sacrifice were mandatory simply to function, where heroism was normal rather than exceptional, where surviving 36 days required luck as much as skill. The 27 Medals of Honor awarded for Iwo Jima represented not 27 extraordinary acts, but 27 acts that happened to be witnessed and documented amid thousands of similar acts. Every Marine who fought the full campaign performed actions that in previous wars would have earned recognition. At Iwo Jima, such actions were simply what was required to survive and advance. The battle destroyed the myth of the suicidal Japanese soldier by demonstrating that suicidal tactics were not culturally determined but tactically chosen. When Japanese commanders chose different tactics, they achieved different results. Kuribayashi's prohibition of banzai charges turned American firepower advantage into an irrelevance. His defense in depth forced Americans to fight on terms that negated their material superiority. In the end, 26,000 American casualties, purchased 8 square miles of volcanic rock, 3 airfields, and a demonstration that the coming invasion of Japan would cost more than the American public would accept. Whether this justified the cost remains debated. What is certain is that the Marines who fought there, the Navy corpsmen who treated them, and the Japanese soldiers who defended against them all participated in one of history's most savage battles. The Japanese had called American tactics suicidal. At Iwo Jima, they proved it. And in proving it, they inflicted casualties that helped end the war through means other than invasion. 21,000 Japanese died to kill or wound 26,000 Americans. By the terrible mathematics of industrial warfare, Kuribayashi's defense was perfectly executed. By the human cost to both sides, it was tragedy beyond calculation. This was Iwo Jima. This was the price paid when two determined forces collided on ground that gave every advantage to defenders who had months to prepare and nothing to lose but their lives, which they had already committed. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.